Gold has no memory. It doesn't remember who was allowed to dream and who was never meant to survive. But the men who rushed into California in 1849 remembered very well. They remembered skin color. They remembered who was supposed to own land and who was supposed to vanish into it. So when a black woman stepped into Sacramento with a battered leather satchel and a gaze sharpened by loss, no one paid her much attention. She looked like someone passing through, someone history would forget they were wrong. Her name was Mary Ellen Hayes, and by 1855 she controlled a fortune that would translate into millions today. More money than any white prospector in the territory. Enough to buy silence. Enough to inspire hatred. What the ledgers and newspapers never explained was this. Mary Ellen Hayes never mined a single ounce of gold. No claims, no pickaxe, no river pans. Her wealth came from another source entirely. One so carefully hidden that men whispered about it behind closed doors, then stopped whispering altogether. Because knowing too much had consequences. Then, in the winter of 1856, Mary Ellen Hayes disappeared. No witnesses, no body, no struggle anyone would admit to seeing. Weeks later, her satchel was found near a cluster of cottonwood trees on the edge of the wilderness. The leather was split. The earth around it had been torn open, clawed apart by desperate hands searching for something that was no longer there. The satchel was empty. And Mary Ellen Hayes vanished so completely that it was as if she had never existed at all. Before we continue uncovering the mystery of Mary Ellen Hayes and the fortune that dissolved into the California wilderness, if you're drawn to the stories history tried to erase, subscribe to Vintage Truths, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. We like to know where our community of truth seekers is scattered across the map. Now, let's go back to 1850 to a woman who shouldn't have survived, let alone thrived. The year Mary Ellen Hayes stepped off the steamship in San Francisco, California was drowning in desperation. The gold rush had transformed the territory into a fever dream of ambition and violence. Men arrived by the thousands. Farmers from Missouri, merchants from New York, failed businessmen from Boston, all chasing the same glittering promise. They tore through mountains, diverted rivers, murdered each other over claims that yielded nothing but mud and disappointment. By 1850, the easy gold was gone. What remained required capital, equipment, and the kind of back-breaking labor that killed men in their 30 seconds. San Francisco in 1850 was barely recognizable as a city. It was a sprawling chaos of tents, wooden shacks, and hastily constructed buildings that leaned at precarious angles. The streets, if you could call them that, were rivers of mud in winter and clouds of dust in summer. Ships sat abandoned in the harbor, their crews having deserted the moment they reached California, leaving the vessels to rot while their former sailors chased gold into the mountains. Some of those ships had been dragged onto land and converted into hotels, stores, and saloons, their masts still visible above the roof lines like the bones of beached whales. The population was transient, desperate, and overwhelmingly male. For every woman in California, there were 50 men, and for every black woman, the ratio was even more extreme. Mary Ellen Hayes stood out not just because of her race or her gender, but because of the way she carried herself, with a quiet dignity that seemed impervious to the chaos around her. She was tall, nearly 5 feet 10 inches in, with broad shoulders and hands that showed the calluses of hard labor. Her skin was dark, her hair kept covered beneath a simple cotton headscarf, and her eyes were the kind that gave nothing away. She wore a plain gray dress, sturdy boots, and carried that leather satchel with a grip that suggested she'd die before letting it go. She spent one night in San Francisco in a boarding house on Pacific Street that charged her triple what they charged white customers. She didn't argue. She paid, slept with her back against the door and the satchel clutched to her chest, and left before dawn. The journey to Sacramento took 3 days by riverboat. The Sacramento River was crowded with traffic, steamships, barges, canoes, anything that could float and carry cargo or passengers inland. The boat Ellen took was called the Senator, a sideway steamer that belched black smoke and shuddered with every turn of its paddle wheels. She stayed on deck the entire journey, refusing to go below where the other passengers, mostly men, stared at her with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. Sacramento sat at the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers, a sprawling tent city that had erupted almost overnight into something resembling civilization. Wooden buildings lined the muddy streets, their facades painted with optimistic names: Empire Hotel, Golden Dream Saloon, Fortune's Favor General Store. But behind the paint, the structures were flimsy, thrown together by men who expected to be rich enough to leave within months. Most never did. The population was overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white, and overwhelmingly desperate. Chinese laborers worked the abandoned claims for scraps, living in segregated camps on the outskirts of town. Mexican miners who had been mining gold in California long before the Americans arrived found themselves driven off their own land by new laws that favored white claimants. Native populations had been decimated by disease and systematic violence. Entire villages wiped out by measles, smallpox, and cholera, or massacred by miners who saw them as obstacles to progress. And black people, free or enslaved, occupied the most precarious position of all. California had entered the Union as a free state in 1850. But that didn't mean equality. Black testimony wasn't admissible in court against white defendants. Black miners were routinely driven from their claims by mobs. Black women especially were assumed to be either enslaved or engaged in prostitution. There was no middle ground in the minds of most white Californians. Mary Ellen Hayes was 32 years old when she arrived. She spoke little about her past, and what she did say was vague enough to discourage further questions. She had come from Missouri. She said she had been enslaved there. She had purchased her freedom. The details of how remained unclear. She rented a small room above a laundry on K Street, paying 3 months in advance with coins that surprised the landlord, a man named Horace Vance, who had expected her to beg for credit like everyone else. Vance was a thin, nervous man from Ohio who'd come to California in 1849 expecting to strike it rich, and had instead ended up running a laundry because it was the only business he could afford. He charged Mary Ellen $15 a month for a room that was barely large enough for a bed and a trunk with a single window that looked out onto an alley where rats fought over garbage. "You got work lined up?" Vance asked when she paid him. "I'll find something," she said. "Not much work for colored women here." "Unless you're willing to find something," she repeated, her voice flat and final. Vance didn't press. There was something about her that made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't have said exactly what. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, like she could see right through his skin to the coward underneath. Or maybe it was just that she didn't act the way he expected a black woman to act. Grateful, subservient, eager to please. She acted like she didn't need him at all, and that more than anything unsettled him. Mary Ellen kept to herself those first 2 weeks. She walked the streets of Sacramento with a purposefulness that made people step aside. She didn't smile. She didn't lower her eyes. She studied everything, the buildings, the businesses, the people. She went to the land office and spent hours poring over maps and property records. She visited the Wells Fargo office and asked questions about deposits and transfers. She went to the docks and watched the riverboats unload cargo. And then on her 15th day in Sacramento, she did something that made every struggling miner in the city take notice. She bought a building. Not a shack, not a tent with a wooden frame. A 2-story brick building on J Street right in the commercial heart of the city. The previous owner, a merchant named Thomas Gaines, had been trying to sell it for months. He'd paid $8,000 for it in 1849, back when he thought he'd make a fortune, supplying miners with tools, food, and equipment. But the market had collapsed. Too many merchants, not enough customers with money to spend. Gaines had lost everything. His wife had left him, taking their 2 children back to Pennsylvania. He was living in a single room above a saloon, drinking himself to death 1 glass at a time. He dropped the price of the building to $3,000, then to $2,500, and still nobody wanted it. Mary Ellen Hayes offered him $3,500. Gaines thought he'd misheard. He was sitting in the land office when she made the offer, and he actually laughed. "You're joking." "I'm not," she said. "You have that kind of money?" "I do." "Show me." She opened the leather satchel and counted out $3,500 in gold coins, double eagles, eagles, half eagles. All of them genuine, all of them gleaming in the afternoon light that streamed through the land office window. Gaines counted the money 3 times, his hands shaking. He kept glancing at Mary Ellen as if expecting her to vanish, as if this were some kind of fever dream brought on by too much whiskey. But she didn't vanish. She just stood there patient and still waiting for him to finish counting. "Where did you get this?" he finally asked. "I worked for it," she said. "Worked how?" "That's my business, Mr. Gaines. Do we have a deal or not?" He signed the deed. He took the money and left Sacramento that same day before anyone could tell him he'd been a fool to sell so cheap. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a mistake. Not because of the price. $3,500 was more than fair for a building nobody wanted, but because of the woman who'd bought it. There was something about her that didn't add up, something that made him think years later, when he was dying in a charity hospital in Philadelphia, that he'd be, and part of something he didn't understand. Within a week, rumors were circulating through Sacramento. Marie Ellen Hayes, a black woman, a former slave, had bought a building in the heart of the city with cash, gold coins. Where had she gotten it? She'd stolen it. Some said she was a front for a white man who couldn't be seen doing business with a black woman. Others claimed she'd been a mistress to a wealthy man back east who'd paid her off. She was running a brothel. She was laundering money for criminals. She'd found a cache of gold hidden by Spanish missionaries. None of it was true, but nobody could figure out what was because Mary Ellen Hayes didn't open a store in that building. She didn't open a saloon or a boarding house or any of the businesses that made sense in a city full of transient men with money to spend. The building sat empty for weeks. She hired carpenters to repair the roof and replace broken windows, but she didn't move in. She didn't advertise. She didn't do anything that would explain why she'd spent $30,500 on a building she apparently didn't need. And then in March of 1851, she did something even more inexplicable. She started buying land, not mining claims, not the played-out riverbeds the desperate men were still sifting through, hoping to find a few flakes of gold that earlier prospectors had missed. She bought parcels of land outside the city, flat, unremarkable stretches of valley floor that nobody wanted, land that had been surveyed and dismissed as worthless for mining, land that flooded every winter when the rivers rose, turning into shallow lakes that took months to drain. She bought the first parcel in March of 1851, 40 acres along the Cosmos River, about 15 miles south of Sacramento. The seller, a man named William Driscoll, thought he was robbing her. Driscoll was a farmer from Iowa who'd come to California expecting to grow wheat and corn, only to discover that the land he bought flooded every winter and baked hard as brick every summer. He'd paid $200 for it 2 years earlier and hadn't been able to give it away since. When Mary Ellen offered him $150, he nearly kissed her. "You planning to farm?" he asked as they signed the deed at the land office. "Maybe," she said. "Well, good luck with that. That land's been underwater, 3 winters running. Anything you plant will just wash away. I'll keep that in mind." Driscoll took the money and left California a week later, convinced he'd finally gotten the better of someone. But he told the story in every saloon between Sacramento and San Francisco, how he'd sold worthless land to a black woman who didn't know any better. People laughed. They called Mary Ellen a fool. They said she'd wasted her money on land that would never produce anything but mud and mosquitoes. But Mary Ellen didn't seem concerned. She bought another parcel in April, 60 acres near the town of Freeport, where the Sacramento River widened into a sluggish, muddy channel. Then another in May, 80 acres along Dry Creek, which was dry only in summer, and a raging torrent in winter. Then 2 more in June and 3 more in July. By the end of summer, she owned over 300 acres of land that, as far as anyone could tell, was completely useless. And then she disappeared for 3 months. She left Sacramento in late August, telling Horace Vance she'd be back before winter. She took a mule, a canvas pack, and that same worn leather satchel she'd arrived with. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't hire a guide. She just rode south alone into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Vance watched her go from the window of his laundry. He felt a strange sense of unease, like he was watching someone walk into a grave. The foothills were dangerous. There were still grizzly bears in those mountains and mountain lions and rattlesnakes as thick as a man's arm. There were abandoned mining camps where desperate men lived like animals willing to kill for a handful of coins. There were native groups who'd been driven into the mountains by white settlers and who had every reason to hate anyone who came into their territory. "She won't come back," Vance said to his wife that night. "Nobody goes into those mountains alone and comes back." But she did come back. 3 months later in November, just as the first rains were starting to fall, she rode into Sacramento on a gray afternoon, her mule struggling under the weight of the pack it carried. She was thinner, sunburned, and her clothes were torn and stained. Why? Dirt, but she was alive. And the leather satchel, which had been nearly flat when she left, now bulged with weight. She went directly to the Wells Fargo office. The clerk on duty was a young man named Peter Whitlock, fresh from Boston, and still naive enough to believe that California was a land of opportunity rather than a graveyard of broken dreams. He looked up when Mary Ellen walked in, and his eyes widened at the sight of her, dusty, exhausted, but with that same unreadable expression she always wore. "I need to make a deposit," she said. "Of course, ma'am. How much?" She opened the satchel and poured gold coins onto the counter. They clinked head and clattered, rolling across the polished wood, gleaming in the lamplight. Whitlock stared at them, his mouth hanging open. $4,000, Mary Ellen said. Whitlock counted the coins twice, his hands trembling. He'd seen plenty of gold in his 6 months at Wells Fargo, but never like this. Never from a black woman who'd just walked in off the street looking like she'd been living in the wilderness. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "I found it," she said. "Found it where?" "In the ground." "You have a mining claim?" "No." "Then how? Are you going to accept the deposit or not, Mr. Whitlock?" He accepted it. He filled out the paperwork, gave her a receipt, and watched her walk out. Then he went to the manager's office and told him what had just happened. The manager, a man named George Sutherland, listened with a frown. $4. 0000. "Yes, sir. And she said she found it." "Yes, sir. Did she say where?" "No, sir. Just that it was in the ground." Sutherland drummed his fingers on his desk. "That's the second time she's made a large deposit. She deposited $3,500 when she first arrived, and now $4,000. That's $7,500 in gold. Where is a black woman getting that kind of money?" "I don't know, sir. Neither do I, but I intend to find out." Word spread quickly. By the next morning, everyone in Sacramento knew that Mary Ellen Hayes had returned from the foothills with a fortune in gold. The rumors that had died down during her absence came roaring back, wilder than before. She'd found a secret mine. She'd discovered a cache of Spanish gold. She'd made a deal with outlaws. She'd stolen it from a mining camp. She'd dug it up from a grave. The truth, as always, remained elusive. The next day, Mary Ellen went to the land office and bought 2 more parcels, and the day after that she hired 3 men, white men, because black men couldn't legally testify to property agreements, to start building something on one of her properties near Freeport. The men she hired were day laborers, the kind of men who'd come to California expecting to strike it rich and had instead ended up doing whatever work they could find to survive. Their names were John Farley, Michael Brennan, and Thomas Yates. She paid them $2 a day, which was good money, and told them she needed a barn built along with a series of irrigation ditches. "What do you plan to grow?" Farley asked. "That depends on the soil," she said. "The soil's no good. This land floods every winter." "I know. Then why?" "Just build what I'm paying you to build, Mr. Farley." They built the barn, they dug the ditches, and they kept their mouths shut because $2 a day was more than they could make anywhere else. But they talked among themselves, speculating about what Mary Ellen Hayes was really doing. None of them could figure it out. The barn was well built, but it was in the middle of nowhere on land that seemed worthless. The irrigation ditches didn't make sense either. Why irrigate land that flooded naturally? She's crazy, Brennan said one night as they sat around a campfire eating beans and hard attack. She's got money, but she doesn't know what to do with it. Maybe, Farley said, or maybe she knows something we don't. Like what? I don't know. But I'll tell you this, she's not stupid. You see the way she looks at things, like she's calculating something in her head. She's got a plan. What kind of plan? That's what I'd like to know. But Mary Ellen didn't share her plans with anyone. She supervised the construction, paid the men when the work was done, and then disappeared again. This time she was gone for only a month. When she returned in January of 1852, she made another deposit at Wells Fargo, $3,000. Peter Whitlock was on duty again. He recognized her immediately, and this time he didn't ask where the money came from. He just counted it, filled out the paperwork, and handed her the receipt. But after she left, he went to George Sutherland's office again. "She's back," he said. Another $3,000. Sutherland stood up. "That's over $10,000 in 4 months. Nobody finds that much gold without a claim. What do you want me to do?" "Nothing. But I'm going to have a conversation with the sheriff." Sheriff Daniel Coburn was a practical man. He'd been elected in 1850, back when Sacramento was still more camp than city, and he'd learned quickly that justice in California was less about law and more about keeping the peace between armed, desperate men. He'd seen claim jumpers hanged by mobs, thieves shot in the street, and more than one man beaten to death over a perceived insult. He'd learned to pick his battles carefully. When George Sutherland came to his office and told him about Mary Ellen Hayes, Coburn listened with the expression of someone who would heard 1,000 variations of the same story. "You're telling me a black woman is depositing large amounts of gold at your bank and you want me to investigate her? I want to know where it's coming from." Sutherland said if she's found a claim, she needs to register it. If she's stealing it, she needs to be arrested. And if she's doing neither, then where is she getting it? Coburn leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Sutherland, unless you have evidence that Miss Hayes has committed a crime, there's nothing I can do. Depositing money at a bank isn't illegal. But if you're concerned about the source of her funds, you're welcome to refuse her deposits. But I'm not going to harass a woman just because she has money and you don't understand where it came from." Sutherland left the sheriff's office frustrated, but he wasn't the only one asking questions. By February of 1852, Mary Ellen Hayes had become the subject of intense scrutiny. People watched her when she walked down the street. They followed her when she rode out to her properties. They asked questions at the land office at Wells Fargo, at the boarding houses and saloons where information was traded like currency. And one man decided he'd had enough of wondering. His name was Samuel Pritchard, and he was about to make a decision that would change everything. Samuel Pritchard was 43 years old, and his life had been a series of disappointments. He'd been a farmer in Pennsylvania, but a bad harvest and mounting debts had forced him to sell his land. He'd tried his hand at business in Philadelphia, but his store had failed within a year. He'd worked as a clerk, a laborer, a teamster, anything to keep food on the table for his wife and 3 children. And then in 1849, he'd heard about California, about gold lying in the rivers waiting to be picked up, about men becoming millionaires overnight, about a second chance for anyone willing to take it. He'd left his family behind, promising to send for them once he'd made his fortune. He'd borrowed money for the passage, sailed around Cape Horn, and arrived in San Francisco in the summer of 1850. He'd bought a mining claim near Auburn in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada and spent 2 years breaking his back for a total of $200 in gold. $200. In 2 years, he was living in a tent eating beans and salt pork and watching younger, stronger men strike it rich while he found nothing. His claim was played out. His equipment was falling apart. And his wife's letters, when they came, were increasingly desperate. She was living with her sister. The children were hungry. When was he coming home? When was he going to send money? He couldn't go home. He had nothing to show for 2 years of work except calloused hands and a cough that wouldn't go away. He couldn't face his wife, couldn't face his children, couldn't face the neighbors who'd watched him leave with such confidence. So he stayed in California, growing more bitter with each passing day. And when he heard about Mary Ellen Hayes, a black woman getting rich while white men starved, it felt like a personal insult. It felt like proof that the world was fundamentally unfair, that God had abandoned him, that everything he'd been taught about hard work and perseverance was a lie. He started asking questions. He talked to the men who'd worked for her, trying to get them to reveal what she was doing. He went to the land office and studied the parcels she'd bought, looking for patterns. He spent hours at the Wells Fargo office, watching her make deposits, trying to figure out where the gold was coming fro. And then he started following her, not openly. He was careful. He'd wait until she left Sacramento, then trail her at a distance, keeping to the tree and watching where she went. He did this for weeks, sleeping rough, eating jerky and hardtack, convinced that if he could just figure out her secret, he could take it for himself. He followed her to her properties near Freeport, near the Cosumnes River, near Dry Creek. He watched her inspect the barns and irrigation ditches. He watched her walk the land sometimes for hours, as if she were looking for something, but he never saw her dig. He never saw her pull gold from the ground. And then on February 14th, 1852, he finally saw something. Mary Ellen had ridden out to one of her properties near the Cosum River. She'd brought the mule, the satchel, and a shovel. Pritchard watched from a hillside hidden behind a stand of manzanita bushes as she dismounted near a grove of cottonwood trees. The trees were old, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches bare in the winter cold. Mary Ellen walked among them slowly as if she were looking for something specific. Then she stopped, knelt down, and started digging. Pritchard's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. She dug for over an hour, the shovel biting into the soft earth, the pile of dirt growing beside the hole. Then she stopped, reached into the hole, and pulled something out from where Pritchard was hiding. He couldn't see what it was, but he saw her put it in the satchel, and he saw the way the satchel sagged with weight when she lifted it. She filled in the hole, smoothed the dirt over it, and rode away. Pritchard waited until she was out of sight. Then he scrambled down the hillside and ran to the grove of cottonwood trees. The hole was gone. She'd filled it in so completely that he couldn't even tell where it had been. He started digging anyway, tearing at the ground with his hands, then with a stick, then with a rock. He dug for hours until his hands were bleeding and his back was screaming in pain. He found nothing. He expanded his search, digging around the cottonwood trees, looking for other holes, other signs of disturbance. He dug until it was too dark to see, and then he kept digging by moonlight, convinced that the gold was there, that he just had to find it. But there was nothing, just dirt and rocks and the roots of the cottonwood trees. He spent the entire night there searching, digging, growing more frantic with each passing hour. By dawn, he'd torn up a quarter-acre of ground and found absolutely nothing. But he'd seen her take something. He was sure of it. The next day, exhausted and filthy, he went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Daniel Coburn looked up from his desk as Pritchard stumbled in. The man looked like he'd been dragged behind a horse. His clothes were caked with mud. His hands were bleeding, and his eyes had the wild, desperate look of someone who'd lost his grip on reality. "Mr. Pritt?"
"Chard,"
Coburn said carefully. "What can I do for you?" "I know where she's getting it," Pritchard said, his voice. "I know where the gold is coming from. Who are we talking about?" "Mary Ellen Hayes. I followed her. I watched her dig it up." Coburn's expression hardened. "You followed her?" "Yes." "To her property on the Cosumnes River. She dug a hole and pulled something out, something heavy. She put it in her satchel and left." "And then what did you do?" "I went to the hole. I dug it up, but there was nothing there." "So you trespassed on her property and destroyed her land looking for something that wasn't there?" "It was there. I saw her take it." "Mr. Pritchard, I'm going to tell you this once, and I want you to listen carefully. You need to leave Miss Hayes alone. You need to go back to your claim, or better yet, go home to Pennsylvania, because if I hear that you've been following her again or trespassing on her property or harassing her in any way, I will arrest you. Do you understand?" Pritchard stared at him, his mouth working soundlessly. Then he turned and stumbled out of the office, but he didn't leave her alone. He couldn't. The obsession had taken root in his mind, and it grew like a weed, choking out everything else. He started talking. He told his story in every saloon, every boarding house, every place where frustrated miners gathered to drink and complain, and the story grew with each telling. Mary Ellen Hayes wasn't just finding gold. She was sitting on a mother lode. She had a Secret mine. She had a map. She had knowledge passed down from someone who'd been in California before the rush, someone who knew where the real gold was hidden. Maybe she'd been given the information by a dying prospector. Maybe she'd stolen it from a Spanish mission. Maybe she'd made a deal with the devil himself. The rumors spread through Sacramento like wildfire, and by March, half the city was talking about her. Mary Ellen Hayes noticed the change immediately. The stares on the street became more hostile. Men would follow her openly now, not even trying to hide it. They'd stand outside her building on J Street, watching the windows, waiting to see what she'd do next. She hired a man named Jacob Stern to accompany her when she left the city. Stern was a former soldier, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, who'd come to California looking for gold and found only disappointment. He was in his 40s with gray in his beard and a scar across his left cheek from a saber cut. He didn't talk much, but he carried a rifle and knew how to use it. "You expecting trouble?" he asked when she hired him. "I'm preparing for it," she said. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes from men who think they're entitled to what I have." Stern nodded. He'd seen enough of California to know exactly what she meant. They rode out together to her properties. Stern always a few paces behind, his eyes scanning the treeing, his hand never far from his rifle. They were followed, of course. Men on horseback, keeping their distance, but always there, always watching. "You want me to run them off?" Stern asked one day. "No," Mary Ellen said. "Let them watch. They won't see anything," and they didn't, because Mary Ellen had stopped digging. She'd stopped making her trips into the foothills. Instead, she focused on her properties, supervising the construction of more barns, more irrigation ditches, more infrastructure that nobody understood. The deposits at Wells Fargo stopped. For 3 months, from March through May of 1852, she didn't deposit a single coin. People started to whisper that she'd run out of gold, that whatever she'd been digging up was gone, that she was finished. But then in June, she did something that made everyone realize they'd been wrong about her from the beginning. She started leasing her land to farmers. Not mining land, not gold claims, farmland, those flat, supposedly worthless parcels that flooded every winter. She started renting them out to farmers who were desperate for land to cultivate. The first farmer to lease from her was a man named Heinrich Mueller, a German immigrant who'd come to California with his wife and 4 children. Mueller had tried mining and failed. He'd tried working as a laborer and barely made enough to feed his family, but he knew farming. He'd grown up on a farm in Bavaria, and he knew good soil when he saw it. When Mary Ellen offered to lease him 40 acres near Freeport for $200 a year, he jumped at the chance. "The land floods," she warned him. "Every winter the river rises and covers everything." "I know," Mueller said, "but when the water goes down, it leaves behind silt, rich soil. I can grow wheat there, maybe vegetables. It's better than anything else I've found in California." He signed the lease in June. By July, he had crops in the ground. By September, he was harvesting wheat that grew taller and thicker than anything he'd seen in Germany. Word spread. Other farmers came to Mary Ellen asking to lease land. She was selective, choosing people who knew what they were doing, people who understood that the floods weren't a curse but a blessing. By the end of 1852, she had 10 farmers leasing her land, and the income from those leases was substantial. But it still didn't answer the question everyone was asking. Where had she gotten the money to buy all that land in the first place? Because even with the leases, even with the income from the properties, the math didn't add up. She'd spent over $20,000 in 2 years, and the only deposits anyone had seen were the ones she'd made after her trips into the foothills. So the rumors persisted, and in the fall of 1853, a new theory emerged. A man named Charles Whitman, a surveyor who'd worked in the Sierra Nevada before the gold rush, claimed he'd heard a story from a Mexican miner about a cache of gold hidden by Spanish missionaries in the 1700s. Whitman told the story in the Golden Dream Saloon one night, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. Missionaries were moving gold from the missions in Southern California up to San Francisco. He said they had mule trains loaded with it, gold candlesticks, gold crosses, gold coins, but they were attacked by a Miwok raiding party somewhere in the foothills. Most of the missionaries were killed. The survivors buried the gold and marked the location with symbols carved into trees. They were going to come back for it, but they never did. Some died of their wounds. Others were killed later. The location was lost. And you think Mary Ellen Hayes found it? Someone asked. I think she found something. Whitman said, how else do you explain it? She shows up with nothing, and within 2 years she's richer than any of us. She's not mining. She's not running a business. She's digging something up, and it's not coming from any claim that's been registered. The story spread through Sacramento, and then through the mining camps in the foothills, and then through San Francisco. It was a good story, romantic, mysterious, just plausible enough to be believable. And people wanted to believe it because the alternative, that a black woman had simply been smarter and more strategic than every white man in California, was too humiliating to accept. Marie Ellen ignored the rumors. She kept leasing land. She kept improving her properties. And in the spring of 1854, she did something that proved she wasn't just lucky. She was brilliant. The winter of 1853-1854 brought the worst floods Sacramento had seen. The American River overflowed its banks in December, and the Sacramento River followed in January. The city became a lake. Water rose to the second floors of buildings. People drowned in their sleep. The tent city was swept away entirely, and the wooden structures that remained were left leaning at drunken angles, their foundations undermined by the current. Mary Ellen's properties, those flat, supposedly worthless stretches of valley floor, were underwater for 3 months. When the water receded in March, something remarkable happened. The land she'd bought was now covered in a thick layer of silt, rich, dark soil that hadn't been there before. And when the farmers started planting that spring, they discovered that the soil was some of the most fertile in California. Hinrich Mueller's wheat crop that year was so abundant that he made enough money to buy his own land. Other farmers had similar success, and suddenly everyone realized what Mary Ellen Hayes had known all along. The floods weren't a disaster. They were a resource. The rivers carried sediment from the mountains, and that sediment was gold, not the kind you could hold in your hand, but the kind that made things grow. Somehow she'd known that the floods would come, that the rivers would deposit nutrient-rich soil, that the land everyone dismissed would become valuable, and she'd bought it for pennies. By summer of 1854, she was leasing parcels to farmers at rates that made her wealthier than any go. LD Strike could have. She wasn't mining, she was farming, or rather, she was renting land to people who would farm it and taking a percentage of everything they grew. It was brilliant. It was legal. And it made the men who'd been harassing her look like fools. But it didn't stop them, because now, instead of being curious about her, they were angry. They felt cheated, as if she'd stolen something that rightfully belonged to them. And that anger was about to turn dangerous. In the summer of 1854, a group of miners and failed businessmen formed what they called the Sacramento Prosperity Committee. It was a polite name for what was essentially a vigilante organization. Their stated goal was to ensure fair distribution of California's resources. Their actual goal was to force Mary Ellen Hayes to reveal her secret, or to drive her out of California entirely. The committee was led by a lawyer named Richard Brennan, a man from Boston who'd come to California expecting to make a fortune representing miners in legal disputes. But there weren't enough disputes to keep him busy, and the ones that did exist were usually settled with fists or guns rather than legal arguments. Brennan was bitter, broke, and looking for a cause that would restore his sense of importance. Mary Ellen Hayes became that cause. She's a threat to the natural order, Brennan said at the committee's first meeting held in the back room of the Empire Hotel. She's accumulated wealth and property that should belong to white men. She's done it through deception, through manipulation, through methods that we don't understand and can't control. And if we allow her to continue, what message does that send? That a Negro woman can come to California and take what she wants? That the rules don't apply to her? There were murmurs of agreement from the 15 men gathered in the room. They were a mix of failed miners, struggling merchants, and laborers who'd come to California expecting opportunity and found only disappointment. They needed someone to blame for their failures, and Mary Ellen Hayes was a convenient target. "What do you propose we do?" asked a man named Walter Simmons, a merchant who'd lost his store to bankruptcy. "We start by pressuring the land office," Brennan said. "We demand an investigation into her purchases. We claim she used fraudulent documents, that she bribed officials, that she manipulated the system. We make enough noise that they have to look into it. And if they don't find anything, then we take more direct action." The committee started their campaign in August. They filed complaints with the land office claiming that Mary Ellen's purchases were illegitimate. They wrote letters to the territorial governor demanding an investigation. They published articles in the Sacramento Union questioning how a black woman could have accumulated so much wealth in such a short time. The land office reviewed her transactions. Every deed was legitimate. Every payment had been made in full in old coin. Every document was properly signed and witnessed. There was nothing irregular about any of it. The committee wasn't satisfied. They started buying up the land around Mary Ellen's properties, hoping to box her in to force her to sell. But Mary Ellen didn't sell. She just stopped expanding. She focused on the land she already owned, improving it, building more infrastructure, making it more productive, and she kept making money. By the fall of 1854, her properties were generating over $10,000 a year in lease income. She was by any measure one of the wealthiest people in Sacramento. That's when the harassment turned violent. In September, one of her barns was set on fire. The structure burned to the ground before anyone could stop it. Mary Ellen reported it to the sheriff, but there were no witnesses, no evidence of who'd done it. "Could have been an accident," Sheriff Coburn said, though his tone suggested he didn't. "Believe it, it wasn't an accident," Mary Ellen said. "Can you prove that?" "No." "Then there's nothing I can do." A week later, fences on another property were torn down. Irrigation ditches were filled in with rocks and debris. Crops were trampled. Again, there were no witnesses. Mary Ellen hired more guards. She armed them with rifles and told them to shoot anyone who trespassed on her properties. She stopped going anywhere alone. Jacob Stern became her constant companion, silent and watchful, his rifle always within reach. But the threats didn't stop. Men would show up at her on the street, calling her names that don't bear repeating. They'd follow her to the Wells Fargo office and demand to know where her gold came from. They'd stand outside her building at night, drunk and angry, yelling threats, until Stern came out with his rifle, and they scattered. In October, the Sacramento Prosperity Committee sent a delegation to her office. 5 men led by Richard Brennan, who fancied himself a reasonable man. They didn't knock. They just walked in as if they owned the place. Mary Ellen was sitting at her desk reviewing lease agreements. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable. "Miss Hayes," Brennan said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "we'd like to have a conversation with you." "Then have it and leave," she said. "We're here to make you an offer. We're prepared to buy all of your properties for $50,000. That's more than you paid for them, and it's a fair price. I'm not selling. Miss Hayes, you must understand the position you're in. You're a woman, and a Negro woman at that. You have no protection here, no legal standing. If something were to happen to you, there'd be no one to speak for you, no one to defend your interests." "Is that a threat, Mr. Brennan?" "It's a reality. We're offering you a way out, a way to leave California, with money in your pocket and your life intact. I suggest you take it." Marie Ellen stood up, realizing she was taller than Brennan, and she used that height to her advantage, looking down at him with those unreadable eyes. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cold and steady, "I've heard enough. You can leave now." "We're not leaving until Jacob Stern stepped forward from where he'd been standing by the door. He didn't say anything. He just rested his hand on the rifle slung over his shoulder. The men left, but the threats escalated. In November, someone broke into her building on J Street. They didn't steal anything. They just tore the place apart, smashing furniture, ripping up floorboards, clearly looking for something. When Mary Ellen arrived the next morning, she found a message painted on the wall in black tar. "Tell us where it is, or we'll take it from your corpse." She stood in the wreckage for a long time, her face expressionless. Then she walked to the sheriff's office. Coburn looked at the damage and shook his head. This is getting out of hand. Yes, it is. Miss Hayes, I think you should consider leaving Sacramento. Go to San Francisco. Start over somewhere safer. I'm not leaving. Then I can't guarantee your safety. I don't have the manpower to protect you 24 hours a day. I'm not asking you to protect me, Sheriff. I'm asking you to do your job and find out who's threatening me. I'll do what I can, but you need to understand there are a lot of people in this city who don't want you here, and some of them are willing to do more than just threaten. Mary Ellen left the sheriff's office and went back to her building. She hired carpenters to repair the damage. She installed locks on every door and window. She bought a pistol and learned how to use it. And she stopped making trips into the foothills entirely for 3 months from November 1854 through January 1855. She stayed in Sacramento. She managed her properties from her office. She met with farmers, negotiated leases, handled her business with the same calm efficiency she'd always shown. But people noticed the change. She was more guarded now, more careful, and the deposits at Wells Fargo stopped again. In December, a rumor started circulating that she'd run out of gold, that whatever she'd been digging up was gone, that she was finished. The Sacramento Prosperity Committee saw an opportunity. They increased their offer to $60,000. She refused again. And then on the night of January 12th, 1855, something happened that changed everything. Samuel Pritchard was found dead on one of Mary Ellen's properties near the Cosmos River. He'd been shot once in the chest at close range. His body was discovered by a farmer named Hinrich Muller, who'd been checking his wheat fields early in the morning and saw a figure lying near the grove of cottonwood trees. Muller rode to Sacramento and reported it to the sheriff. By noon, Coburn was at the scene along with a deputy and a doctor who served as the county coroner. Pritchard had been dead for several hours. He'd been shot with a large caliber rifle, the bullet entering his chest and exiting through his back. He died almost instantly. Near his body was a show. And the ground around the cottonwood trees had been torn up as if he'd been digging. He was looking for her gold, Muller said. Everyone knows he was obsessed with it. Coburn examined the scene carefully. The ground was soft from recent rains, and there were footprints everywhere, Pritchard's, and at least 2 other sets. One set was smaller, possibly a woman's. The other was larger, a man's boots. Who else was here? Coburn asked. I don't know, Muller said. I just found him like this. Coburn sent his deputy to bring in Mary Ellen Hayes and Jacob Stern for questioning. They came willingly. Mary Ellen sat in the sheriff's office with that same unreadable expression while Stern stood by the door, silent and watchful. Mr. Pritchard was found dead on your property, Coburn said, shot with a rifle. Can you tell me what happened? I can, Mary Ellen said. I was there. Coburn leaned forward. You were there? Yes. Jacob and I went to the property last night to check on the irrigation system. When we arrived, we found Mr. Pritchard digging near the cottonwood trees. He had a gun. He pointed it at us. He said he was going to find what I'd been hiding, and if I tried to stop him, he'd kill me. And then what happened? Jacob told him to leave. Mr. Pritchard refused. He fired at us. Missed? Jacob fired back. Didn't miss. So you're saying it was self-defense? Yes. Coburn looked at Stern. Is that what happened? Yes, sir, Stern said. Why didn't you report it? We were going to, Mary Ellen, but it was late and we were shaken. We decided to wait until morning. I didn't expect someone to find him so quickly. Coburn sat back in his chair. He believed them. Or at least he believed that Pritchard had been trespassing and had probably been armed. But he also knew that arresting a white man for killing another white man in defense of a black woman was going to be complicated. I'm going to have to arrest Mr. Stern. He said there'll be a trial. A jury will decide if it was self-defense. I understand. Mary Ellen said Stern was arrested and held in the county jail. The trial was scheduled for March. The news spread through Sacramento like wildfire. Samuel Pritchard, the man who'd been obsessed with Mary Ellen Hayes, had been shot and killed on her property. Jacob Stern, her hired guard, had been arrested, and now there would be a trial. The Sacramento Prosperity Committee saw their opportunity. They hired a prosecutor, a man named Thomas Langley, who'd been a district attorney in New York before coming to California. They packed the courtroom with their supporters. They made sure that every newspaper in California knew about the trial. This was their chance to destroy Mary Ellen Hayes. The trial began on March 15, 1855. It was held in a makeshift courtroom in a building on J Street packed with miners, merchants, and curiosity seekers. The room was hot and stuffy, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco smoke. Jacob Stern sat at the defense table, silent and stoic, while Thomas Langley laid out the case for the prosecution. "Gentlemen of the jury," Langley said, pacing in front of them, "the facts of this case are simple. Samuel Pritchard was found dead on property owned by Mary Ellen Hayes. He was shot with a rifle. Jacob Stern carries a rifle. He was hired to protect Miss Hayes, and multiple witnesses will testify that Mr. Stern threatened Mr. Pritchard in the past, warning him to stay away." He paused, letting that sink in. "The defense will claim that this was self-defense, that Mr. Pritchard was trespassing, that he was armed, that he threatened Miss Hayes. But I ask you to consider this. Why was Mr. Pritchard on that property in the first place? What was he looking for? And why did Miss Hayes and Mr. Stern feel the need to go to that property in the middle of the night?" He turned to face the jury directly. "I submit to you that Mr. Pritchard was murdered because he knew too much, because he discovered something that Miss Hayes wanted to keep hidden. And Mr. Stern, acting on her orders, killed him to protect that secret." It was a compelling argument, and the jury listened intently. But then Mary Ellen Hayes took the stand. She wore a simple black dress, her hair covered with a dark scarf. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm and composed. Her lawyer, a man named David Foster, who'd agreed to take the case despite the controversy, asked her to describe what had happened at night. She told the story in a clear, steady voice. She and Jacob had gone to the property to check on the irrigation system. They'd found Pritchard digging near the cottonwood trees. He'd been armed. He'd threatened them. Jacob had defended them. "Miss Hayes," Foster said, "Mr. Langley has suggested that Mr. Pritchard was killed because he knew too much. What do you say to that?" "I say it's nonsense." Mary Ellen replied, "Mr. Pritchard didn't know anything. He thought I had a secret mine or a cache of gold or some hidden treasure. He thought that's where my money came from, but he was wrong. Then where did your money come from?" Mary Ellen looked at the jury. She took a deep breath. "I was enslaved for 23 years, she said. I was owned by a man named Robert Hayes, a plantation owner in Missouri. He was a cruel man, but he was also a careless man. He kept his money in a safe in his study, and he thought I was too stupid to notice the combination, but I watched him open it every day for 10 years. And when he died in 1849, I opened that safe, took everything inside, and bought my freedom from his widow." The courtroom went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. "I took $12,000, she continued. "Money he'd made selling crops grown by people he enslaved, money he'd made selling people. I took it and I used it to come to California. I used it to buy land that I knew would be valuable because I'd spent my entire life watching white men underestimate the intelligence of black people. I knew they'd dismiss floodplains as worthless. I knew they'd chase gold instead of thinking about soil, and I knew that if I was patient, if I was smart, I could build something they'd never be able to take from me." She paused, her eyes moving across the faces of the jury. "There is no secret mine," she said. "There is no cache of gold. There is no hidden treasure. There is only land and the willingness to see value where others saw nothing." Thomas Langley stood up. "Miss Hayes, you expect this court to believe that you stole $12,000 from your former owner?" "I didn't steal it," she said. "I took what was owed to me. 23 years of labor, of suffering, of being treated as property instead of a person. $12,000 doesn't begin to cover that debt. But you admit you took the money without permission. I took what was mine. And what about the deposits you made at Wells Fargo? The $4,000 in November of 1850, the $3,000 in January of 1852. Where did that money come from?" Mary Ellen smiled just slightly. "I didn't spend all $12,000 at once, Mr. Langley. I kept some in reserve. I made deposits when I needed to make it look like I was finding gold. because I knew that if people thought I was just another prospector, they'd leave me alone. But I was wrong about that, wasn't I? Langley pressed her for another hour, trying to find inconsistencies in her story, trying to trap her in a lie, but she didn't waver. Her story remained consistent, plausible, and most importantly, impossible to disprove. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found Jacob Stern not guilty. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some people cheered, others shouted in anger. Richard Brennan and the members of the Sacramento Prosperity Committee stormed out, their faces red with rage. Mary Aline Hayes sat quietly, her expression unchanged. She'd won, but she knew the victory would come at a cost. After the trial, Mary Aline Hayes became something of a legend. Newspapers in San Francisco picked up the story. The Alta California ran a front-page article titled, "The Richest Negro Woman in California." The Sacramento Union published an editorial praising her remarkable intelligence and business acumen. Even the New York Tribune mentioned her in a piece about the changing demographics of the West. Some praised her ingenuity. Others condemned her for theft, conveniently ignoring the fact that the money she'd taken had been earned through the enslavement of human beings. But everyone agreed on one thing: she was the richest black woman in California and possibly the richest black woman in America. By 1855, her properties were worth over $200,000. She employed dozens of people: farmers, laborers, carpenters, guards. She'd built a network of farms that supplied Sacramento with grain, vegetables, and fruit. She'd proven that wealth in California didn't have to come from gold. It could come from land, from patience, from seeing opportunities that others missed. But the harassment never fully stopped. There were always men who resented her success, who couldn't accept that a black woman had outsmarted them. She continued to hire guards. She continued to arm herself. And she continued to build. In the fall of 1855, she bought a house in Sacramento, a real house, not a room above a laundry. It was a 2-story Victorian on H Street with a garden and a white picket fence. It had been owned by a merchant who'd gone bankrupt and fled to San Francisco. Mary Ellen paid $5,000 for it in cash. She furnished it with care, filling it with books and furniture and all the things she'd never been allowed to own. She had a parlor with velvet curtains. She had a dining room with a mahogany table. She had a bedroom with a real bed, not a straw mattress on the floor. For the first time in her life, she had a home. She threw a small gathering in November, inviting the farmers who leased her land and a few of the merchants who treated her fairly. It was a modest affair: coffee and cake, polite conversation, but it was significant. A black woman hosting white people in her own home in a city where black people weren't even allowed to testify in court. Heinrich Muller attended with his wife. "You've done something remarkable," he told her. "You've built something that will last." "I hope so," Mary Ellen said. "You should be proud." "I'm cautious," she said. "Pride comes before a fall." She was right to be cautious. In December, she received a letter. It was unsigned, written in a crude hand on cheap paper. It said, "You think you've won, you haven't. We know what you took. We know where you've been, and we're going to take it all back." She showed the letter to Jacob Stern. He read it and frowned. "You think it's the committee?" he asked. "Probably. Or someone connected to them. What do you want to do?" "Nothing. They're trying to scare me. I won't give them the satisfaction." But she increased security anyway. She hired 2 more guards. She had locks installed on every door and window of her house. She stopped going anywhere without Jacob. And then, in January of 1856, she made a decision that surprised everyone. She announced that she was taking a trip. "Where are you going?" Jacob asked. "Back to the foothills," she said.